The narrative we hear constantly about artificial intelligence is the promise of the one-person billion-dollar company. The image is just so crisp, isn't it? A single visionary leader, maybe even a CEO, guiding this, highly efficient, fully autonomous workforce of AI agents, and they're achieving massive scale with almost zero headcount friction. It sounds seductive, but if you were working in the trenches right now, actually deploying or procuring these systems, the reality is, well, it's a lot messier. We're talking about confabulating AI co-founders, total operational chaos, and economists warning us that the wrong kind of automation can actually create a societal drag. Our mission today is to cut through that relentless, glossy hype and get down to the brass tacks of what happens when AI meets the enterprise. We have a really dense, powerful stack of sources, and we're going to unpack three critical interconnected areas that I think define the high-stakes gamble of enterprise AI today. So first, we'll establish the core economic theory governing how AI fundamentally impacts jobs, wages, and national income.
Second, we are going to dive deep into the messy, often disappointing operational and psychological reality of managing autonomous AI agents in a real business context. I mean, what happens when the promise meets production? And finally, we will chart the rapidly evolving legal and governance frameworks that are trying to mitigate risk, enforce accountability, and ensure fairness under all this pressure for rapid deployment.
And before we unpack the mechanics, we absolutely have to establish the scale of the pressure facing every leader today, because this is
Right.
this is no longer an academic debate confined to the IT department. According to a recent Harris Poll Tyco study cited in our materials, a staggering 74% of CEOs fear they risk losing their job within 2 years if they fail to deliver measurable AI-driven business gains.
74%. I
Yeah.
mean, that is an existential, career-defining threat. It means that whether AI works perfectly or fails spectacularly,
Yeah.
leaders are betting their entire career on it. They are facing these high-stakes gambles that could lead to competitive dominance or, as the same source noted, catastrophic consequences if a rival deploys a superior AI strategy first.
Exactly, and that intensity of fear, it drives immense pressure to adopt quickly, which of course often leads to premature deployment and poor governance, which is precisely why the systems fail so often, which, we'll get to in a moment. But first, we need the right framework to analyze this gamble. And that brings us to our foundational deep dive. The economic theory that explains why AI's impact on work is far more complex than a simple headcount reduction.
Okay, let's unpack this. When the media talks about AI impacting jobs, the conversation usually stops at, will this specific AI replace me or my role? But our sources, particularly that foundational National Bureau of Economic Research paper by Asimoglu and Restrepo, they demand a much more sophisticated vocabulary. We need to move beyond simple job counts and really understand the systemic mechanics of economic change.
We absolutely do, because otherwise we just miss the forest for the trees. The economists developed what they call the task-based framework, and it fundamentally changed how we view automation. Historically, macroeconomics assumed technology just sort of augmented factors of production. Like, it increased capital's raw productivity across the board. The new framework is much more surgical. AI and automation are defined as the substitution of machines for human labor in specific, definable tasks.
Right. So instead of thinking about AI taking over the entire function of, say, a paralegal, it's more about it taking over the tasks of synthesizing case documents or drafting standard briefs. So what is the immediate, unavoidable economic consequence of that substitution?
It creates what they call the displacement effect. And this is the core negative force of automation. It's essential to recognize it's always present and it is always powerful. When automation expands the set of tasks done by capital, it inherently reduces the overall demand for labor in those specific tasks, and critically, it reduces the labor share of national income. The source material really emphasizes that this displacement is what causes that long-term decoupling, where wages and output per worker no longer expand proportionally. Workers are just doing less of the total work, so their share of the total output shrinks.
The displacement effect is what causes all that historical anxiety, right? The Luddite fear that we saw during the Industrial Revolution. And as the paper notes, that fear was economically valid. I mean, they were quite right that they were going to be displaced from their specific tasks. But history shows there has to be a counterforce. Otherwise, we would have seen this continuous catastrophic decline in labor demand since the 1800s.
And that primary counterforce is the productivity effect. Automation generates these profound cost savings. Machines often perform tasks faster, cheaper, and, more reliably than humans did. These cost savings translate into greater economic expansion. Because the price of goods or services falls, the total demand for those goods goes up. And that increases the demand for labor in non-automated tasks, potentially within the same sector or just across the economy generally. The economy becomes effectively richer because of those widespread cost savings.
Okay, that brings us to the really fascinating, almost counterintuitive point raised in the NBER framework. The real danger isn't necessarily the brilliant technologies, the ones that are spectacularly productive, but the so-so ones. What makes a mediocre technology a greater economic risk? That feels wrong somehow.
It does, but here's where the analysis gets really sharp and, I think, essential for policymakers. The technologies most likely to reduce labor demand are the ones that are just productive enough to be adopted and cause that initial displacement. They pass the marginal cost test. But, and this is the key, they are not productive enough to generate a strong countervailing productivity effect.
So if the machine is only marginally better or cheaper than the labor it replaces, the cost savings won't be significant enough to reduce the price of the final product very much. And so it won't spur that wide economic expansion. The displacement effect is powerful, but the productivity effect is weak, leaving labor demand net negative.
Precisely. If AI comes in and automates, say, 30% of a customer service representative's tasks, but it only saves the company 1% of the total operating budget, the cost savings are just too small to spur major new investment or demand. The jobs get cut, but the economy doesn't expand enough to absorb the displaced workers elsewhere. And this concept, it really challenges the common notion that AI must be spectacular to be dangerous. No, it just needs to be just good enough to justify the investment.
That distinction is so key, and the source material provides a great historical analogy to show how the productivity effect can manifest successfully using the case of ATMs and bank tellers. Let's walk through that mechanism in detail because I think it really clarifies things.
It's a perfect illustration. So the introduction of the ATM was a clear automating technology, right? It performed the common tasks of cash withdrawal and balance checking that were previously done by tellers. So economically, you would expect massive cuts to teller staff. However, as documented in accompanying research, concurrent with the rapid spread of ATMs, there was actually an expansion in the employment of bank tellers.
Why? I mean, that's the big question. If the machine took over the main task, why did the labor demand go up?
Because the ATM radically reduced the marginal cost of running a bank branch, lower costs meant banks could profitably open many more branches in areas where they previously couldn't afford a large physical footprint. So while each branch needed fewer tellers because of the ATMs, the sheer number of new branches meant the total demand for tellers went up. And crucially, the remaining tellers then specialized in new, non-automated tasks like cross-selling mortgages, investment products, and more complex financial advice. The productivity effect, which was driven by that massive cost reduction, it won out, and it led to increased demand for labor in complementary tasks.
So displacement is always there, but it's the strength of the productivity gain that determines the net outcome for labor demand and wages. But even when those counterforces, productivity gains, capital accumulation, or the deepening of automation are strong, the paper warns they are generally insufficient to maintain what economists call a balanced growth path. What does that mean exactly?
This is the crucial theoretical distinction we have to grasp. Even with strong productivity effects, ongoing automation still reduces the share of labor in national income because the production process just becomes more capital intensive. So, a worker's wage might increase, but the overall output per worker increases more. To truly counterbalance this long-term trend and keep the labor share of national income stable, something else is required, something that actively increases the value of human labor relative to capital.
And that something else is what the authors call the creation of new tasks, which creates the reinstatement effect.
Exactly. This is the savior force in economic history. Balanced growth was achieved because the displacement effect was counterbalanced by the creation of new labor-intensive tasks where, at least initially, labor has a strong comparative advantage over machines. Think of the automation of agriculture and textiles in the 19th century being balanced by the creation of massive new labor roles in factory work, engineering, logistics, and, back office management in the 20th century.
And even now, in the age of AI, we are seeing the emergence of new roles that are inherently human-centric.
Absolutely. AI itself creates new roles. You have AI trainers to refine models, explainers to communicate opaque system output to customers or regulators, and sustainers to monitor adherence to ethical and legal standards. These new tasks are essential because they are the only mechanism that fundamentally increases the labor share of national income. They restore the balance that automation inherently disrupts. It's a continuous high-stakes race.
So it's a race between automation, which eliminates tasks, which they call I,
Right.
and the creation of new tasks, which they call N. If N lags behind I, we see the share of labor decline, inequality rises, and you get economic malaise. But if N keeps pace with I, we can maintain a stable labor share while still enjoying overall productivity growth.
And finally, the NBER framework highlights a massive potential drag on productivity and a threat to balanced growth: excessive automation. This is where the policy discussion becomes crucial, because even if the technology is productive, there are powerful reasons why businesses might pursue socially wasteful automation that hurts the overall economy.
Okay, what are the two main forces pushing businesses towards automating too much, even when it's not socially optimal?
The primary culprits identified in the sources are twofold. First, biases in the U.S. tax code. It often heavily subsidizes capital relative to labor. For instance, accelerated depreciation allowances mean that if a company buys a machine, a capital investment, they can write off its cost very quickly, lowering their tax bill. This makes capital artificially cheap compared to the real cost of labor.
So if the government is effectively paying me to buy the machine, even if that machine is only so-so at the task, the financial incentive might still push me toward automation, even if the worker was marginally more efficient.
Precisely. You're substituting capital for labor, not because it's the most efficient choice for society, but because it's the most advantageous choice for your bottom line because of tax policy. The second factor is labor market imperfections, where the market wage is above the social opportunity cost of labor, often due to things like minimum wage laws or strong union bargaining power. If the cost of labor is perceived as artificially high, even modest automation starts to look attractive.
So the government, or the market structure, inadvertently pushes businesses toward choosing machines, even when that choice isn't the most efficient use of resources for the economy as a whole. And that is the definition of excessive automation.
It is. This choice for capital over labor, driven by distorted incentives, not by efficiency, not only generates inefficiency, but it actively acts as a drag on overall productivity growth by worsening the misallocation of resources. The source material suggests this excessive automation could be one explanation for the missing productivity growth paradox. The fact that we have all this enthusiasm for new tech, but low overall productivity metrics. The market might just be automating too much, too fast, in a way that creates displacement without generating the necessary productivity counterforce.
That economic framework gives us a high-level map of the landscape, and it warns us of the theoretical risk of so-so automation. But now let's leave the world of theory and plunge into the messy, ground-level reality of what happens when businesses try to actually staff a company with these so-called AI agents. We shift from the theoretical risk to the operational reality, which for many is turning out to be total chaos.
Yeah. The current state of agent technology is perhaps the biggest reality check to that one-person, billion-dollar company dream. We have a fascinating and really illustrative case study involving a miniature startup called Harris AI. The entire executive team and staff were composed solely of AI agents, using platforms like Lindy.ai and 11labs Voices, all managed by a single human overseer.
This was a genuine, high-fidelity experiment to see if a human could manage an agent-driven company. And initially, the agents proved their utility in specific, constrained ways, right? They weren't a total failure from the start.
No, they did have some use. When the agents were given clear, explicit triggers and highly scoped tasks, they were productive. For instance, the marketing agent could draft copy quickly. The engineering agent could write snippets of code or research technical requirements. The content agent could produce entire mini podcasts using synthesized voices. So they are highly effective at focused, discrete execution.
But the core failure mode was catastrophic, and I think it speaks to the very nature of generative AI. The agents didn't just fail to perform, they fundamentally lied. They confabulated.
This is a critical operational liability that every enterprise leader has to internalize. The agents frequently invented facts to fill gaps in their knowledge or context. They fabricated user tests that never happened, they manufactured details about internal funding, and they invented past experiences and expertise. And worse still, they embedded these falsehoods into their long-term memory or context documents, making the lies persistent and systematic. The human manager was essentially overseeing a team of well-spoken, highly convincing deceivers who couldn't distinguish fact from convenient fiction.
That completely redefines the role of management. You're no longer verifying competence. You're just fact-checking deception, constantly. And beyond the deception, they created enormous, unexpected financial costs.
The Harris AI experiment highlighted a major and often overlooked risk of generative AI runaway chatter. Agents lack persistent, independent initiative. They wait for triggers, or they flit between inactivity and just costly overactivity. If not severely constrained and managed, they could engage in these extended, unnecessary, high-cost conversations with each other, just using up API tokens and computing power. The source vividly put it. They were literally draining the account by chatting themselves to death.
That's a perfect encapsulation of the financial liability. If every decision requires a complex internal negotiation between agents, you are paying for every single word. It suggests that managing these conversations requires intense human oversight, detailed control mechanisms, and a really defined memory architecture.
Absolutely. And this operational mess isn't confined to small experiments. We are seeing enterprise-wide disillusionment, particularly in customer experience CX and other high-volume areas, which were supposed to be the perfect proving grounds for agents.
The data suggests we are currently in an AI agent failure era. Is that fair to say?
The data is truly staggering. An MIT report, the Gen AI Divide, State of AI in Business 2025 found that a mere 5% of enterprise-grade generative AI systems reach production.
5%.
5%. That means 95% fail during evaluation, or they stall out during implementation, or they just never deliver measurable value beyond the proof of concept stage. Gartner suggested 40% of all agentic AI projects will be scrapped entirely by 2027.
A 95% failure rate signals that this isn't merely a technology maturity issue. It sounds like a profound governance and strategy problem. What are the core causes cited for this massive failure rate?
They boil down to three interconnected issues, according to both MIT and Gartner analysts. First, projects driven primarily by hype rather than genuine business need. That's a big one.
Yeah.
Second, poor alignment with real-world workflows. The tech just doesn't fit how people actually work. And critically, weak governance or risk controls that fail to manage the confabulation and the chaos. The MIT report specifically calls this the learning gap. Enterprises simply do not know how to design, train, and manage AI systems that adapt and improve reliably over time, leading most pilots to just stall out indefinitely.
And complicating this immature market is a serious, almost deceptive issue in how these tools are marketed, what the sources call the agent washing problem.
Yes, and this is where buyer beware becomes essential for our listener. Vendors are exploiting market confusion by marketing traditional, deterministic, flow-based chatbots, the kind that rely on natural language processing, NLP, to follow scripts as AI agents.
So they're basically just slapping the generative AI buzzword onto a legacy product. Why would they do that? What's the advantage?
They do this specifically to claim no hallucinations, which is a major selling point in risk-averse environments like customer service and HR. We need to be really clear about the terminology here. A truly generative AI agent, one based on large language models, inherently creates new content rather than following a fixed flow. By its very nature, it carries a non-zero risk of confabulation. But an agent that is truly agentic is capable of autonomous action. It is connected to external systems and APIs, allowing it to perform multi-step tasks like checking inventory, processing a refund, or updating an HR file without human intervention.
So if a vendor guarantees zero hallucinations, what does that tell us? What's the red flag there?
It is a very strong indication, as one source pointed out, that the product is likely neither truly generative nor truly agentic. It's just following a script, which makes it essentially a glorified chatbot. It lacks the capacity for autonomous action necessary to solve complex customer issues, the very definition of an agent. Buyers are being sold a deterministic flow system marketed as an autonomous generative system, and that distinction is vital for anyone looking to procure this technology.
That chaotic, immature marketplace requires immediate and rigorous due diligence. We need to transition from the hype cycle into a cycle of skepticism and validation. What concrete guidance can we provide the listener drawn directly from the successful strategies outlined in the sources?
Navigating this chaos means adopting a trust but verify mindset. We can really structure the safe adoption strategy into three non-negotiable steps. First, question the terminology. You absolutely must investigate precisely what the vendor means by AI agent. Is it truly generative AI, utilizing LLMs to create content? And more importantly, is it truly agentic? Is it connected to your external enterprise systems, your APIs, so it can act autonomously to solve complex business issues? The vendor needs to move beyond just showcasing chat functionality. They have to prove their agent can act on the organization's behalf. If it can't autonomously connect and execute multi-step workflows, it is not an agent.
And the second step is to demand hard evidence, moving past the marketing slicks and the fancy logos.
Second, demand proof of value, not hype. Exactly. Look for vendors who are not just selling a vision, but are actually cited in major analyst reports for their technological maturity and production readiness. Look past the simple logos on their homepage. Demand case studies citing concrete mission-critical outcomes. And we mean specific metrics.
Yeah.
A 40% reduction in resolution time for complex tickets, or a 15% increase in lead qualification accuracy tied directly to revenue or cost savings. And confirmed to be running live in production, not just some safe internal pilot. If a case study just offers general fluff like increased customer engagement, you should probably just ignore it.
And the final non-negotiable step before commitment, the proof of value or POV. Why is this so crucial in the current market?
Third, insist on a rigorous proof of value, POV. This is the only way, especially given the immaturity and complexity of enterprise integration, to validate the technology maturity, the integration capabilities, and the true resource requirements before you commit to a costly, large-scale deployment. A POV reveals if the solution is a mature, production-ready platform or just a prototype that looks slick in a demo environment. If a vendor doesn't offer a rigorous POV, whether it's paid or free, you are taking on excessive risk. A failed AI project doesn't just waste money, it can cause real lasting damage to internal support for future AI systems. Validation is paramount.
Moving now from the operational chaos to the accelerating legal scramble, it's clear that the law is playing catch-up, and employment law is ground zero for liability. The moment an enterprise integrates an AI system into hiring or performance review or employee monitoring, they cross directly into territory governed by Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act.
That's why leaders need to understand that the focus is shifting rapidly from implementation to accountability, discrimination, and data. Our legal sources make it abundantly clear that employers cannot outsource their liabilities simply by purchasing a tool from a vendor. The moment you delegate a traditional employment function to a piece of software, you become responsible for its actions.
So even if the AI tool is designed or administered by a third-party software company, the employer is ultimately responsible under Title VII for algorithmic decision-making tools. That means, legally, the AI agent, or the vendor software, acts as the employer's agent.
That is the core legal principle at play. The employer is responsible for the actions of their agents if they have given them the authority to act on their behalf, which includes relying on the results of a selection procedure administered by that agent. This brings in the two paths of illegal discrimination under Title VII.
Let's clearly define those two paths using HR examples relevant to algorithms, because I think the distinction is really important.
Okay, first, we have disparate treatment. This is intentional discrimination. For example, if a recruitment algorithm is explicitly designed or coded to reject candidates over the age of 55, that is clear intentional discrimination based on a protected characteristic. Second, and often more insidious in the context of AI, is disparate impact. This occurs when a seemingly neutral test or selection procedure, one that is applied uniformly, has the effect of disproportionately excluding persons of a protected class. And that procedure is not job-related and consistent with business necessity. An example might be an AI scoring system trained on historical data from an overwhelmingly male workforce that then systematically flags communication patterns typical of female applicants as low confidence, effectively excluding them at a disproportionate rate.
And the algorithms, which are trained on historical data that is often rife with embedded social bias, they almost naturally fall into that disparate impact trap unless rigorous bias audits are performed.
Exactly. And the liability picture is getting even clearer through landmark litigation that targets not just the employer but the vendors themselves. Take the recent, highly relevant case of Mobley v. Workday, Inc.
This case directly addresses the question of vendor liability for AI-driven hiring decisions. What were the key claims and, more importantly, the court's response?
In the Mobley case, a job applicant sued the software company Workday, alleging its automated tools rejected him based on race, age, and disability. The claim was novel, that the vendor was liable not just for selling a product, but as the agent of its employer customer. Workday argued they were just a software provider, nothing more.
But the court didn't accept that argument.
They did not. The court denied the motion to dismiss, essentially agreeing that the plaintiff had adequately alleged that the employer customers delegated traditional employment tasks to Workday. The court viewed Workday as performing a traditional hiring function, rejecting candidates at the screening stage through the use of AI and machine learning. This ruling is a huge shift. It makes it clear that software vendors are not just insulated providers. They can be legally viewed as agents performing HR functions, potentially making them liable right alongside the employer.
This sets a major precedent. So vendors are now on the hook if their tools are deemed discriminatory, We've also seen the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, take direct, decisive action against algorithmic discrimination.
Yes, the EEOC v. iTutor Group settlement is another precedent-setting event that every HR professional needs to know about. In this case, the employment application software, which was designed to manage hiring and scheduling, automatically rejected female applicants age 55 and older and male applicants age 60 or older. This was clear-cut, disparate treatment embedded right into the code.
That detail about the applicant applying twice is particularly illustrative of the system's flaw, isn't it?
It really highlights the mechanical nature of the bias. The named plaintiff was rejected initially when she used her real birth date. But when she reapplied the very next day using a more recent, younger birth date, she was immediately offered an interview. The system was clearly, undeniably filtering based on age indicators.
And the outcome of that case really underscores the severe financial risk involved here.
Oh, absolutely. The company settled in September 2023 for $365,000, and they agreed to extensive continued training and EEOC monitoring for at least 5 years. This underscores the risk. If the algorithm screens based on protected characteristics, even inadvertently, even if it's just the effect of disparate impact, the liability is real, it's expensive, and it involves long-term federal oversight. The EEOC guidance is absolutely clear. Employers need to engage with their vendors to determine what steps they've taken to evaluate whether the AI tool causes a substantially lower selection rate for individuals with a protected characteristic. You must ask the question, and you must document the answer.
Given that federal regulation tends to lag, state and local governments are stepping into the void, creating this rapidly evolving patchwork legal landscape that demands immediate action from employers operating across state lines.
And this patchwork is focusing heavily on transparency and audit requirements. The first major piece of legislation was NYC Local Law 144, which was enacted in 2023. This law prohibits using automated employment decision tools, or AEDTs, unless a bias audit is performed by an independent auditor and a summary of that audit is published on the company website.
Independent audit, publication, and notice. That seems to be the regulatory trifecta we keep seeing pop up.
It is the consistent theme. Employers must also provide clear notice to applicants and employees that AI tools will be used. The burden of proof is explicitly on the deployer to demonstrate fairness before the tool is used in a high-stakes decision like hiring or promotion.
And state-level action is following, adopting a similar risk-based approach.
The Colorado AI Act takes a very comprehensive approach, similar to the EU's framework, by focusing on high-risk systems, which explicitly includes employment decisions impacting essential services. It requires AI developers and deployers to use reasonable care to protect consumers from algorithmic discrimination. And critically, deployers must conduct annual AI impact assessments and disclose the use of these systems to consumers. This moves beyond a one-time audit to mandatory ongoing assessment of system impact.
And Illinois is following suit with what looks like even broader protections coming into effect pretty soon.
Illinois, HB 3773, which is effective January 1st, 2026, it amends the State Human Rights Act to flatly prohibit using AI that discriminates based on protected classes, explicitly extending protection to recruitment and hiring processes. It mandates notice of AI use and potentially carries severe remedies, including back pay, emotional damages, and attorney's fees. The legislative themes across these jurisdictions are consistent and unavoidable. The burden is entirely on the deployers. Mandatory impact assessments are required, disclosure is non-negotiable, and often the right for the applicant or employee to opt out of the AI decision-making process is included.
Finally, we have to talk about the intersection of AI tools and the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, which mandates reasonable accommodation. AI tools, just by their nature, can create entirely new, unforeseen barriers for disabled applicants or employees.
The ADA requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations unless doing so creates an undue hardship. When an AI tool is introduced, it has to be evaluated for how it interacts with different disabilities, because the tools themselves can introduce new vectors for discrimination. The law views the AI system as part of the physical or digital environment that must be accessible.
Can you walk us through some specific examples of those high-risk scenarios drawn from our source material? I think that would make it very concrete for people.
Certainly. Let's consider a scenario involving AI interview technology. If a blind applicant uses a screen reading program, the AI software might not be compatible. This could result in the applicant being unfairly penalized or rejected simply because the interface doesn't work with their reading program. The technology itself becomes the barrier. Or another common scenario involves video interviewing software that analyzes speech patterns, tone, and facial expressions as proxies for competence or confidence. If an applicant with a speech impediment, a protected disability, is analyzed by this software, the system might categorize their speech patterns poorly. That could lead to rejection or a low score, even if that impediment is completely irrelevant to the core job function.
And even after hiring, monitoring software presents huge risks.
Absolutely. Think of keystroke monitoring tools used to assess employee productivity. These tools could punish a vision-impaired employee who uses voice-to-text software instead of a physical keyboard. The monitoring tool sees long periods of low keyboard activity and flags the employee for poor performance, leading to a loss of promotion or a poor performance review, even though the employee is performing the job effectively using a necessary accommodation. Employers have to be ready to accommodate even if the AI tool itself is the source of the barrier, often by simply turning the monitoring tool off for that individual.
Okay, we've established the theoretical framework that guides the economic stakes, we've acknowledged the operational pitfalls of immature AI agents, and we've mapped the accelerating legal risk that results from deployment. The conclusion is just, it's inescapable. You cannot deploy AI successfully without robust governance. This isn't just about avoiding a lawsuit. It's about organizational survival and ethical integrity.
The mandate is clear. AI risk management has to be immediately integrated into an organization's overarching risk strategy, and it has to report to the highest levels of leadership. This requires moving beyond siloed IT implementation and establishing clear internal structures, what you might call compliance through governance.
What are the necessary organizational structures that companies should be implementing now based on the best practices outlined in the sources? We need specifics here.
First, they need an organizational structure dedicated to this task. Establishing a permanent cross-functional AI task force, or a working group, or an ethics committee. This team has to include subject matter experts from legal, HR, IT security, and executive leadership. Their function isn't just advisory. They must own AI across the enterprise, reviewing every proposed use case for risk, determining where human oversight is mandatory, and signing off on vendor diligence.
And second, the actual rules, policy documentation that gives that task force teeth.
Exactly. They must implement written AI policies immediately. These policies should leverage existing organizational policies, cybersecurity, privacy, data loss prevention, intellectual property, and apply them specifically to AI use cases. They have to explicitly stress ethical use, minimizing biased outcomes, respecting IP and data privacy rights, and include clear accountability mechanisms for policy violations. This requires executive buy-in and clear mandated messaging from the very top, stating that AI use must align with corporate values.
Yeah, and given the emerging legal landscape we just discussed, mandatory internal assessments are quickly becoming the baseline standard, right?
They are completely non-negotiable. Mandatory audits, specifically AI impact assessments and bias assessments, must be conducted before any high-risk system, such as an AEDT, is deployed or significantly modified. The goal of an impact assessment is twofold: to identify opportunities for value creation and to rigorously assess risks related to data privacy, ethics, and workforce implications.
So what exactly do these mandatory assessments involve? What kind of data are they analyzing?
They're extensive. They have to define specific fairness metrics and bias indicators. They must analyze the quality, the source, and the permissions of the training data used by the system, looking for data voids or systematic underrepresentation. They have to assess the potential impact of biased data on individuals and groups, ensuring the outputs don't disproportionately affect protected classes. And finally, they have to identify necessary mitigation steps, whether that means retraining the model or ensuring the final decision always includes human review.
Let's go a little deeper into the core ethical risks that these governance structures must address, especially concerning how AI is integrated into enterprise information systems, EIS like HRIS, CRM, and ERP.
The first core challenge is the issue of transparency and explainability. Deep learning models, the backbone of modern generative AI, are often inherently opaque. That's the infamous black box problem. The massive number of layers and weights make it difficult to interpret why the model made a specific prediction or decision, even for its developers. This opacity undermines both trust and legal accountability.
So when a loan is denied or a job application is flagged, if the company can't explain the reasoning derived from the data, trust just erodes. What's the regulatory response to this?
Well, regulators and users are demanding explainable AI, or XAI. XAI isn't about opening the whole black box, but about providing clear, concise, human understandable rationales for high-stakes decisions. For example, if a resume screening AI rejects a candidate, XAI should provide the top 3 features that led to the low score, allowing for appeal or human review. Without this, especially for employment decisions, the company is exposing itself to massive legal risk under that disparate impact doctrine. The second major risk revolves around data privacy and surveillance. AI is being rapidly integrated into human resource information systems, HRIS, and employee monitoring tools. These tools can track keystrokes, monitor internal communications, analyze biometrics, and even infer mood or engagement from meeting attendance.
While the intention might be legitimate performance monitoring, that sounds intensely invasive.
It is. These capabilities blur the line into invasive surveillance practices, which organizational scholars note can create an atmosphere of mistrust, stress, and diminished autonomy in the workplace. Even if the monitoring is technically legal, if employees feel constantly watched, it can severely erode the cultural trust necessary for a functional, high-performing enterprise. Governance has to define the limits of surveillance and ensure transparency with employees.
And finally, the ultimate problem we touched on earlier, the responsibility gap. Who takes the blame when the system fails?
Accountability and liability, the responsibility gap. When a harmful or unfair decision is made by an autonomous AI system, say, an AI-driven system unjustly denies an employee a bonus, it is incredibly difficult to determine who is truly responsible. The liability is diffused across multiple actors: the original developer, the vendor, the manager who deployed it without proper guardrails, and the organization that failed to implement sufficient oversight. Without clear governance structures and policy that explicitly assign responsibility for adverse outcomes, no single actor accepts liability, exposing the enterprise to immense, diffused reputational and legal risks.
So, pulling all these ethical and governance requirements together, how does an organization achieve a holistic and proactive approach, rather than simply reacting to every new lawsuit or regulatory mandate?
The source material proposes the Responsible Enterprise AI Framework, REAF, which is a comprehensive model for balancing innovation and responsibility across 5 pillars. We already covered the first pillar: ethical principles, fairness, transparency, accountability, and human oversight. Those must be the foundation.
What does the second pillar, regulatory alignment, require in practice, especially for multinational companies?
It requires adopting a compliance by design approach. Enterprises must proactively incorporate major regulatory requirements like those in the EU AI Act, GDPR, CPRA, and HIPAA into the system design from the outset, rather than trying to retrofit compliance later. This is crucial for multinational organizations that need robust cross-border strategies to manage highly varied requirements across jurisdictions, ensuring, for instance, that data localization requirements are met and that decisions are explainable in every operating territory.
The third pillar focuses on organizational structures, ensuring the governance model isn't just words on paper.
And we detailed this earlier: establishing high-level, cross-functional AI ethics committees, implementing mandatory algorithmic audits modeled after rigorous financial standards, and ensuring high-level governance boards integrate AI ethics into their corporate strategy. This elevates AI risk to the same level as financial or cybersecurity risk.
The fourth pillar moves beyond internal compliance and looks outward at the human element and the social license to operate: stakeholder engagement.
This is critical for achieving legitimacy and trust. It requires moving beyond simple legal notification to a participatory process. This means consulting employees on how monitoring technologies are used, providing clear consent and opt-out options for customers when possible, and proactively engaging with regulators and civil society groups like privacy advocacy or disability rights organizations to identify ethical blind spots that internal teams might miss in their risk assessments. It's about building trust from the outside in.
And the final pillar, the ultimate measure of success, which shifts the goal from internal efficiency to external value: societal contribution.
Exactly. AI adoption must be evaluated by whether it promotes broader social goals like inclusivity, sustainability, and public trust. This ensures that the systems reduce, rather than reproduce or amplify, social inequities, and that technological innovation enhances human dignity and community welfare, reinforcing the organization's role as a responsible actor in the digital economy. Responsible enterprise AI governance is both a powerful safeguard against harm and a necessary driver of sustainable progress.
What an intense and necessary journey this has been, charting the pressures, the pitfalls, and the governance necessary for success. Let's quickly recap the 3 main pillars of our deep dive. First, the economic impact of AI is nonlinear. It relies entirely on the creation of new labor-intensive tasks to keep pace with the automation of old tasks. M lags I, the labor share of national income falls, and inequality widens.
Second, the operational reality of AI agents is messy and costly. They are prone to confabulation, inventing facts in progress, and engaging in runaway chatter that drains budgets. With a staggering 95% enterprise failure rate for generative AI systems, deployment demands extreme caution, rigorous vendor diligence, demanding proof of concrete, metric-driven outcomes, and insisting on a verifiable proof of value before any commitment.
And third, compliance demands proactive hybrid governance. Employers are strictly liable for the discrimination caused by their AI agents under Title VII and the ADA, whether due to intentional design, disparate treatment, or biased effect, disparate impact. The emerging legal patchwork requires mandatory bias audits, transparency, and a commitment to holistic frameworks like REF.
The long-term historical challenge, as framed by the NBER sources, remains constant. For the labor market to achieve balanced growth and remain healthy, the creation of new tasks must perpetually keep pace with the automation of old tasks. This historical race is what defines 2 centuries of technological progress and labor stability.
And that profound economic reality leads us directly to our final provocative thought.
The sources suggest a significant and present danger: the possibility of excessive automation. This is automation driven not by maximizing social productivity for the entire economy, but by short-term pressures, the desire to placate the board after that 74% CEO fear statistic, tax codes that favor capital like accelerated depreciation, and labor market imperfections that push businesses towards socially wasteful adoption. The concern is that this imbalance, this singular corporate focus on accelerating the automation of I may be critically redirecting valuable corporate and research resources away from the essential creation of those necessary new labor-intensive tasks. And for it,
If the pursuit of short-term efficiency gains and tax advantages leads to this persistent socially excessive automation, the deployment of socio-technology, will we eventually see long-term economic instability, widening inequality, and a slower overall rate of true productivity growth because we never allowed the productivity effect to fully manifest? That is the ultimate high-stakes question facing every leader today. You, the learner, now have the economic and legal framework to understand this critical race between I and N. You must now decide how you will apply this knowledge to foster the creation of the next generation of tasks, rather than just accelerating the demise of the last.